Well, thanks. First, I want to thank Malav and Blue Stockings. This is the first presentation for this book, and it seems like it's an important event for me. In some ways, as Malav mentioned, this is the third of a trilogy, and unless we're starting to do prequels after this, it's closing a certain chapter. In fact, the last 15 years for Tony, my co-author, and I, more or less involved the majority of our intellectual energies working on this one project. And so this makes for an event for me to, in a way, reflect on that. My colleague Fred Jameson calls it the Empire Trilogy, which makes it sound like science fiction. And I think actually for some of those who like the books, and also especially for those who don't like the books, our books do read like science fiction sometimes. But it's an interesting, it's an interesting moment for me to reflect back on it. Okay, here I'll talk for about 20 minutes and then pass to Neil, for whose presence I'm also very grateful to come here today. Okay, so I'll talk about 20 minutes and then pass to Neil, like I said. So one way to start to approach the idea of the book is from this. It struck Tony and I, that there was a certain apocalypticism that was dominating contemporary conceptions of power. What seemed to us an excessive focus on sovereignty, on the state of exception, considering the sovereign precisely, and this in more academic versions of the discourse, considering the sovereign as the one who rules over the exception, and thus as one who stands both inside and outside the law. This also functions, I think, in non-academic, and it has for the last even decade or so, in readings of power, this kind of what we're calling apocalypticism or excessive focus on sovereignty, which really focuses on those elements of power that stand above and outside the law. It's of course true that in the last period, especially during the 8 Bush years, there were plenty of examples of this state of exception. Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, Patriot Act, you can go on and on of the examples of this. But it seems to us that this was in fact not a useful focus either for orienting political action or for analyses of power. It seems to us rather that the primary forms of power that confront us are much more earthly and mundane. On the one hand, they're completely embedded within legal structures and institutions of governance. That they function, and also, secondly, this might be the second thing, that they function primarily through the rule of property. So, in a way, the plea started with us thinking. The book started as a kind of plea, I guess I would say, to stop confusing politics with theology, and return to the critique of power in its daily institutions, and specifically, what this book focuses most on is the critique of property. The rule of property, of course, has its own forms of violence that function through daily mechanisms, through finance, through real estate values, through exploitation on the job. And so, if one starts from that perspective of the critique of property is coupled, at least in our perspective in this book, with an affirmation of the common. The common, which we're conceiving as neither private property nor public property. And let me give you two, they're in a way a division of two forms of the common that at least seem to me a good introduction to the concept. On the one hand, there's what one might call the natural common, which is generally referred to as commons with the S. In other words, the land, the air, the water. Natural, in fact, doesn't quite function. It's because it's never, of course, unworked or entered by society, but that might be an introduction. Whereas what we focus on more actually in this book is what one might first call the artificial common. That is, those forms of common goods that are the products of human labor and the products of social labor, such as languages, codes, ideas, images, affects. And part of our argument is that these largely immaterial goods are taking center stage within the economy. It's an argument we've had for quite some time. So think of these as two forms of the common. The natural common and the artificial common even though I know that those terms aren't quite adequate. The functioning of neoliberalism over the last 30 years has highlighted, in many ways, the conflict between property and the common in both of these regards. In other words, neoliberalism has been both, of course, involved the privatization of the public, of public goods, but it's also involved the privatization of both these forms of the common. So that in the first case, think of strategies to privatize water rights or rights to lithium in Bolivia, privatize oil in Uganda, diamonds in Sierra Leone. These are all in a way thinking about the commons of the earth in a way that are being transformed into private property. Has been one of the strategies of neoliberalism, which in fact seems perfectly adequately and helpfully described as a kind of accumulation by dispossession or a kind of primitive accumulation extended. Also, though, neoliberalism has been about privatizing what I was calling the artificial common. In other words, like, for instance, through patents and copyrights, the privatization of music, of codes, but also of genetic information, indigenous knowledges, et cetera. Like, for instance, what the Brazilians, and I suppose others too, call biopiracy is an example of this neoliberal privatization of this common. What they mean by that primarily are the privatization of indigenous knowledges, or say the medical uses of plants, the way that, say, Monsanto would gain a copyright over traditional indigenous knowledges or knowledges of plants. This is a kind of piracy. It's actually, it seems to me, an interestingly poor use of the term piracy, because pirates at least have the nobility to steal private property. What's done here is actually transforming transforming the common into property, which is in fact something different, and in many ways worse. So anyway, our question for the book, if that makes sense to you, at least as what we're a general notion of what we mean by the common. The question for a book is, what would be, like, how could one develop a politics of the common? What would be institutions of the common, or what would be forms of common self-governance? This is the project, that we set ourselves. And so, speaking with Malev and also thinking about Neil's expertise, I thought I would just give one example of this in terms of urban space, an example of how common functions within urban space as a way to illustrate what the dimensions, I guess, of a politics of the common would look like. And so one of the hypotheses we pose in the book goes like this, and I'll try to just explain that as the example. The hypothesis is that the metropolis is to the multitude what the factory was to the industrial working class. And we mean this hypothesis in three senses, or at least you can divide it into three things, which I'll try to explain very briefly before turning over the microphone to Neil. It's like the factory. The metropolis is like the factory in the sense that it's the site of the production, first. The second, that it's the site of exploitation and expropriation. Second, and third, that it's the site of revolt and resistance. So in the first sense that the metropolis is for the multitude the site of production, this is in a way goes along with a much longer standing notion, let's say, that production in the recent era and increasingly today extends outside of the factory walls. You think of this as a hypothesis of a social factory, let's say. But it goes along with the much larger economic claim or hypothesis that Tony and I have been trying to work on in several books that I mentioned earlier, which is that today factory and industrial production is no longer the central force within the capitalist economy, but rather in its place. I think actually that first claim is not very controversial, and many people would agree. The second part, in its place, is what I think many wouldn't agree with, but at least it's part of our claim, which is that in its place as the central and in some ways guiding element of the capitalist economy is what we sometimes call immaterial production, or at other times called biopolitical production. And what we mean are really forms of production whose results are, at least in part, immaterial, such as the production of ideas, the production of codes, production of affects, images,